when I was at Marvel, a comic book often could sell around 100, 150,000 copies,
Mm-hmm.
and that meant you probably had at least 75,000 readers. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
these days, the only way a comic book can achieve that is by having multiple covers,
Yeah, I
and
believe.
your readership is tiny compared to what it was.
Hey, you Stygian dogs. In this, part 2 of a conversation with Conan's compatriots, Steve Saffel and Brian D. Anderson, we talk about weird tales and the appeal of regular short stories, the reality of diminishing comic book and mass market paperback sales, and Steve and Brian share their first encounters with Conan. That and so much more.
Today, we have the approach that was taken by Tolkien, the approach that was taken by Terry Brooks, the approach that was taken by Robert Jordan, the approach that was taken by George R.R. Martin. And we see these people who create these huge and sweeping fantasy vistas.
Mm-hmm.
And what we forget is that Howard was a guy sitting in Cross Plains writing short stories. He was not necessarily
It's probably 3 miles down the road.
he was not necessarily trying to create these huge vistas and huge story cycles that we create today. It was
Mm-hmm.
meant to be something that was published in short chunks, month after month. And one of the reasons that we did the entire ebook program of short stories that's
Mm-hmm.
happening, that you're included in and that other authors are included in, we did that to try to replicate what it felt like to get each issue of this magazine, of Weird Tales. And the whole idea was that I wanted readers today to be able to go each month and get a new story and then know that there was another one coming up the next month.
Yeah.
Because that's something, I mean, happily, Weird Tales is back, but there are no venues that are quite like what they had. John Joseph Adams had Fantasy Magazine, but even the online magazines are struggling at the moment due to changes in the online venues. And
Yeah.
so it's tough because there was something about getting the latest magazine that had a new Howard story, a new Lovecraft story, a new Clark Ashton Smith, a new Seabury Quinn.
Kind of
And
makes me wonder if that's why comics have kept their appeal over the years. That you get your monthly issue of Iron Man or whatever comic you're into, and you read that, and you have to wait a month to get the next one.
but we're seeing that fade because when I was when I was at Marvel, a comic book often could sell around 100, 150,000 copies,
Mm-hmm.
and that meant you probably had at least 75,000 readers.
Yeah, yeah.
These days, the only way a comic book can achieve that is by having multiple covers,
Yeah, I
and
believe.
your readership is tiny compared to what it was. And frankly, the I think that ebooks are one of the best likelihoods of serial fiction.
Mm-hmm.
You
I
see
think
some of that in the lit RPG world.
well, what I'm noticing, and here's where I'm by no means listen. Should anybody listen to me for visions of the future? But I'm thinking because there's still a large number of people who want a book in hand. I mean, there's no age restriction on that. There's young people who they want physical copies of books, but ebooks, e-comics, all these things are number one, less expensive, easier to produce. But what I'm thinking is going to happen is you're going to have the days of the mass market paperback and trade paper is going to sort of fade out. And since the people who are wanting the mechanical copies are okay with spending a little more money, you're going to see those in more like hardback and leather bound editions than you do today. I think the days of the paper, because there's just fewer people who read mechanical copies compared to an ebook.
Yeah.
Well,
Prestige
the
copies,
days of the
hard to
mass
buy.
market paperback are it's a serious struggle for a couple of reasons. One of which is the willingness to spend the amount of money it costs to buy a mass market paperback today, $8.99, $9.99, $10.99. There's more resistance to that. They are going to want to get something a little bit bigger, a little bit more substantial, like a $14.99, $15.99 trade paperback, a $24.99, $27.99 hardcover. They do want the artifact. But also, to be honest, I think that the reason that people bought mass market paperbacks was that they were inexpensive. They could buy it in the airport on the way to wherever they were going, and then they could just pitch it in the trash at the other end after they'd finished their flight. And the fact is that there were collectors of mass market paperbacks, but but mass market was considered to be cheap and easy consumption.
It was the ebook of its day.
It really was. And that was, interestingly enough, the two formats you've just mentioned were how I came to Conan. I came to Conan first with the Roy Thomas, Barry Smith comic book, #1. As a matter of fact, I remember the prototype Conan that appeared in one of the horror comics, I believe. However, that led me to find the Lancer editions of the mass market paperbacks, where we first saw the Frazetta covers.
Were you already in the industry, or were this was just a simple fandom?
This was just, as a fan. I didn't join the industry until about 10 years later.
Okay.
And but the fact is that I had there been a Weird Tales pulp, at that point in time I probably would have subscribed to it. I did always love science fiction and fantasy short stories. I still think one of the best collections of all time is the first Science Fiction Hall of Fame that Bob Silverberg put together. To this day, it's a brilliant book, and I sought to replicate that somewhat, working with Brian Schmidt on the what's it called? The Infinite Stars series. But again, in this day and age, anthologies do not sell the numbers that novels do.
No, I've been part. They don't sell as many as they did just 10 years ago. I've been a part of a couple of anthologies that either made or came close to being on USA Today, their list. And the 5 years later, you're selling anthologies with huge names, Mark Lawrence, Kevin J. Anderson, and they're not selling a quarter of what they used to.
Now, I will say that the new anthology that Jordan Peele just did, working with John Joseph Adams, that one did hit the Times list briefly.
Okay. But
Jordan Peele is quite a name to conjure with these days. And in the fantasy world, unless it's George R.R. Martin or Patrick Rothfuss, you don't tend to have those numbers even in the novels. But for example, if an anthology came out where, say, George R.R. Martin did a new story of Fire and Ice, then that probably would have the opportunity to cross over. Although George is making it a little difficult on his fans.
Well, actually, I came to Conan through Robert Jordan.
Right.
Because I grew up in small, not unlike Howard. I mean, little small southern town in Alabama. I had like 1,800 people, a little bit bigger than his town, but all we had is the K&B drugstore across the street that had a pretty decent little sci-fi fantasy section. Right. And after I kind of wiped through, I mean, at 12 and 13 years old, after I wiped through all that, there was, there was nothing. I had to wait till we made the occasional trip over to Mobile to the B. Dalton bookstore. And by that time, I had discovered that saw the Conan movie, but there was really, and I wanted more, but I had to wait. And the first one that was on the shelf that I saw was the Jordan book. And I read so fast. I saw the Howard stories, and there was one anthology of Howard's, but they also had the small little novellas. And when you read as fast as I did when I was at that age, I was going to get the thickest one I could find, get my money's worth.
Right.
So, and I didn't have the internet to even know Howard had come up with Conan. I mean, it's not something I had. The repository of all knowledge, as far as I was concerned, was the encyclopedia, and Conan wasn't in the encyclopedia.
Wasn't in the Britannica.
So right. I had no idea who started Conan till much later, and I was reading all the Jordan Conan, and all his the people came after him in that sort of era. Till I finally, when I ran out of those, that's when I discovered the Howard stories, which I remember being sort of like taken aback at first because the style was so different. And I mean, it had that real poetic style that Howard's known for. But I'd say I came on the Conan with all the little mass market paperbacks of the 1980s. So, and it's funny to see. And then, of course, the comics came out, the Savage Sword of Conan, Conan the King, Conan the Barbarian, all that. I started collecting comics back when they were 55 cents each. So to put a date on that, how much are they? About $20 each now?
It seems about like that, yeah.
They can be. I know the new series goes for, what is it? The American price. I think it's $4.99 US.
Jeez Louise.
And that's actually cheap. $3.99 US. I pay $4.99 Canadian, I think, or $4.50 Canadian.
Good Lord God in heaven.
But that's actually great. That's a good price.
That is actually inexpensive by today's standards.
Yeah, easily $10 Canadian.
See, I remember you were talking about the multiple covers and stuff like that. I remember the first time I noticed it, I pretty much stopped collecting comics at that point. But remember the Death of Superman, and they had like 3 covers for the Death of Superman.
Yeah,
and because I think they had 5 different colors on the first Tales of the Dark Knight.
Yeah, and it was like, and they became, because at that point, for some comics started becoming a commodity, and people were like heavily investing in them. And somebody actually broke in my apartment and stole my comic collection during that.
I remember it became popular, especially in the late 90s. I collected on and off through different years, but there was this period in the late 90s. And I just remember thinking, who are these idiots that are buying all these different covers? And now the Conan comes out and I'm grabbing every single variant there, but I guess it has to do with disposable income. But yeah, like it used to seem like a silly prospect. But if that is what is carrying the comic industry now, it's not.
I used to, my favorite Conan of my teens was definitely Savage Sword. I mean, it was all in black and white. You had that wonderful, beautiful covers, but it was all just inked, if you recall. I know it was on that cheap paper, but the damn things were only like $1.50, $2 or something like that. And you got some unfiltered, some raw stories. For some reason, they could get away with content in those that they could not get away with in the comics. And I don't know what that was about. Maybe Steve, you could tell me.
Well, I know that when I first bought Savage Tales, I bought the first one that came out in, I'm trying to remember what year it was, but the cover, it had a rated M on the cover, and the price was 50 cents. It had a John Buscema painting on the cover. The interior story of Conan was The Frost Giant's Daughter by Roy and Barry. And that was a very risque magazine. But magazines were a way that people were able to do something that was not going to be affected by the Comics Code Authority.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Because,
that's why heavy metal was able to get away with the shit that it did.
and if you think about it, that goes back to when Bill Gaines began Mad Magazine, because after he ran afoul of the government with his EC Comics, he decided to get out of comics and go, and he made Mad into a magazine, and by being a magazine, he didn't fall under the purview of the Comics Code Authority. He didn't do anything as extreme, certainly in Mad Magazine, but Martin Goodman, who was the publisher of Marvel, had for years been doing not only comics, but a number of pulps, and he did a bunch of men's magazines. I think Martin did Stag magazine, for example. And
Okay.
in those magazines, you tended to have risque single panel cartoons and risque photography.
Mm.
And
Okay.
so it was literally, it was basically soft core porn. But that,
I can get on board with that.
and then that sort of begat what Jim Warren did with things like Creepy and Eerie and Vampirella.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was the success of things like the Warren magazines that led Martin to decide to try to do his own group of magazines like Savage Tales, which then led to Tales of the Zombie, Savage Sword of Conan, Monsters Unleashed. So there were Marvel did quite a few magazines for a while, and I think the longest running one, without a doubt, would be Savage Tales.
Well, I remember
Excuse me,
one of the
would be
problems I
Savage
had
Sword of
with
Conan.
Savage Sword of one of the problems I had with Savage Sword of Conan wasn't the magazine itself. Of course, it was brilliant. I loved it, but the comic where you could keep your comics in good order. They had bags, they had boards. The magazines, you didn't have nothing. You just had to. And the thing, by the time 2 months later, the magazine was basically a rag. If
Yeah,
you read it at all, it was just hard to keep it. And I don't know if in those particular comics, unless I'm misremembering, were not made with the highest quality paper.
No.
well, comics in that day were not meant to be made with high quality.
Yeah.
The idea was that they were cheaply manufactured, and that was one of the few things that made them profitable. One of the things that caused comics to lose their luster with retailers was the low profit margin. I mean, you
Okay.
just couldn't make that much money on a 12-cent comic book.
No, you can't. Well, I mean that I know that because they weren't all it was just pencil and ink in the Savage Sword,
Right.
except for the cover, which is why I assume why those magazines were so inexpensive, considering the content you use. I think you got 2 stories. Sometimes it would be 2 Conan stories. Sometimes it'd be Cole the Conqueror.
Yeah.
Sometimes it would be, but it was always a Howard, or Red Sonja would a story once in a while. Mostly it'd be 2 Conan stories, and which was cool. You got this, as opposed to a comic, where you were getting, this episodic, continuation. You were getting 2 complete stories for the price of what you're imagining the price of one was. And when you're a kid, it was basically 2 for 1.
Well, but at the same time, you have a situation where cheap fiction, comics to a great degree replaced the pulps.
Yeah.
But you got to keep in mind that the pulps were created as cheap fiction. I mean, here's a beautiful J. Allen St. John cover on Weird Tales.
Oh, wow.
But you've also got to keep in mind that the interiors were not necessarily super high quality.
No.
And I mean, this is a Howard story. This is Worms of the Earth. And again, I have a tremendous appreciation for this kind of an experience, but it is a
Mhm.
very different experience than what, well, again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Today, you have people who want things to be exactly the same, but they want them to be different, but they want them to be the same. So they don't really want the material to evolve. And if you evolve and they don't agree with you, then you'll end up with a huge pushback that will quite
Mhm.
conceivably harpoon the attempt to do something new.
Thanks for watching, liking, and subscribing. Join me for part 3 of Conan's Compatriots, Steve Saffel and Brian D. Anderson. And don't forget to check out Brian D. Anderson's Conan the Child, releasing December 26th from Titan Books. And until next time, take it easy, you stitching dogs.